So here I go again. This is George DeWars. This is me reading chapter 8 of the book, Getting It, 8 Facts That Fuel Recovery If We Face Them. And got an illustration for this chapter right there. Looks like it shows up pretty well. This is, I think, my 4th or 5th attempt. I gave up on my iPhone today, and this is now my iPad. The second attempt on the iPad. First time I just had too much glare. I was getting too close. Anyway, I'm going to read this for you, and there's a little bit of a passage on frustration where I will share my struggles with the iPhone and the iPad. It's called Grow Up or Die. I have been really been looking forward to writing when I wrote it and reading it today, to reading this particular chapter, to sharing the immaturity that floods a mind when it says one won't hurt, or F it, and picks up the first drink drug of relapse. That's what this book is all about, just over and over and over. I'm sure if you read or listened to the whole book, you're probably thoroughly sick of it by now, but maybe sick of it in a good way. But a mind that's flooded with one won't hurt or F it, and is picking up the first drink, drug, whatever. I'm looking forward to passing on 2 of my all-time favorite quotes about long-term recovery by people in long-term recovery. And I even get to tell a story about facing my own immaturity. Of the 2 quotes, the darker one goes, quote unquote, "My disease pointed a gun at my head and told me to grow up or die." Pretty stark. You still hear that from time to time. It's not any one person saying that. The kinder, gentler version goes, quote, "I had a long and difficult childhood, right up until the last day of my drinking, drugging, whatever it I was hooked on." What exactly is immature about saying, well, I'll just have one, and picking up the first drink, drug, whatever? Well, is it wishful thinking or not? Will the tooth fairy or the cavalry or the Easter bunny come or not? Am I shivering on an ice-cold floor in front of gleaming porcelain, or am I blissfully swaddled in my own wishful thinking? What is the difference between grown-up and childish thinking after all? Isn't it the increasing ability to base belief and action on fact over desire, reality over wish? Your challenge, dear reader or watcher or listener, your challenge is to look at your own experience. Don't take my word for it. Have you decided to pick up that first one with a thought promising you will stop there, only to get railroaded by the engine of craving? How many times? Have you done this even after facing your need to quit drinking or drugging or whatever you're hooked on? In other words, have you had the experience of getting that it really is the first drink or drug or whatever, only to have a craving you did not feel, or maybe you felt it, seduce your thinking sometime later? They say you cannot turn a pickle back into a cucumber, but they never said a light that comes on cannot go off. The Big Book tells the story of the whiskey and milk relapse, a struggling member who convinces himself that just one can't hurt if he blends whiskey with his milk. No one said wishful thinking can't be creative. Unamused, the authors of the Big Book emphasize, quote, "This type of thinking has been characteristic of every single one of us." And they conclude, quote, "We call this plain insanity." Could they have not called it plain childishness or even plain silliness? Joseph Wambaugh was an author and a cop who wrote insightfully and often about alcoholic policemen. He once observed how silly criminal thinking is. Perhaps arresting officer and addict perpetrator often have more in common than they realize. As Shakespeare said, each must play his part. What he forgot to mention is that different parts can speak the same lines. One won't hurt. No one will know. I can handle it now. Same disease and same childish trap, whether you wear the badge or the cuffs. And what about the relapse that begins with F it? Isn't swearing reserved for grown-ups? And don't we curse and fix over real grown-up problems? Maybe even need to. Well, yeah. Most of us don't start swearing until about age 6, when we are old enough to delight in how naughty it is. We don't achieve real proficiency, though, until age 12 or so. And most adults swear or spit out some expletive when frustrated, at least sometimes. What most adults don't do is reach for alcohol or drugs or whatever, much less get so consumed with consuming they don't even remember what the big deal was. A child seeks pleasure as the antidote to pain. Binkies, blankets, cookies, and thumbs. An adult looks for ways to make things better, and at least for ways to not make them worse. Schedule the dental appointment. Call the IRS. Forgive your friend. Enough about you. Let's talk about me. How I know so much about immaturity, my inside source. You see, I was around when the whole inner child thing got invented or discovered or whatever you want to call it. My first reaction to the concept was psychobabble. Even though I had actually gone to graduate school with Claudia Black, author of, quote, "It Will Never Happen to Me," unquote, far and away our best professor was Laurie Dwinell, co-author of After the Tears, Reclaiming the Personal Losses of Childhood. Both books are still around and still well worth reading. And my attitude was not immediately changed by the first national ACOA, that's to say Adult Children of Alcoholics, conference. Both of those two people spoke at that conference, by the way. I still have my folder from the conference. We gathered at the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, California in 1983. What was the crowbar that pried open my mind? Might have been dynamite. A week or two after the conference, I was playing doubles tennis, throwing my racket, cursing, almost weeping with frustration. Apparently, that fuzzy yellow ball was defying my will. Embarrassing. So embarrassing that I drove home beating myself up. Literally. I could not slap the side of my face hard enough to make the shame go away. I'd acted like a 3-year-old, and I knew it. That is when I had my holy shit moment. Wait a minute. Just exactly who am I hitting? I asked myself. You don't suppose it couldn't be? Holy shit. That is what they mean. Pretty sure my body sagged at that point, but not for long. I soon felt an exhilaration that almost always comes when we get something important, like the 8 important things in this book. It wasn't a burning bush, but I'll take it. It would be nice to tell you that my inner child and I lived happily ever after, that I never threw another tennis racket or raged at my computer again. But I have become much better at recognizing when less mature parts of me have awakened. At using adult wisdom to take care of that childish and wounded part of myself. And facing together the molehill or the mountain that woke him up. This nurturing does not include coddling him with alcohol or drugs. Well, maybe the occasional cookie, but we aren't here to talk about my type 2 diabetes. It is much more likely to include quiet time, also known as meditation and prayer, perhaps taking him to a meeting or calling our sponsor or therapist. All three if he's really upset. The reason to connect and deal with your, quote, inner child, simple. To make being a victim a fact about your history, not a racket in your game. Remember, Bill and Bob, the other founders of 12-step, Bill and Bob, and the other, sorry about that. Bill and Bob and the other founders of 12-step recovery were not developmental psychologists. The ones who study how babies keep growing from one stage into another and then start paying taxes. The first 12-steppers were what we call participant observers, observing and sharing experiences they were living. And the Big Book describes the moment of relapse almost entirely in mental terms, not as a symptom of immaturity. The list of their labels, mostly for wishful thinking at that fatal moment, these are all in quotes: old threadbare idea, great obsession, peculiar mental twist, plain insanity, insidious insanity, curious mental phenomenon, insanely trivial excuse, insane, strangely insane, strange mental blank spots, queer mental condition, mental twist. All these descriptions, but two, include variations of, quote, mental, unquote, or insane. And the two exceptions are mental events, an idea or an obsession. The Big Book authors repeatedly express a layperson's dismay when he or she sees the craziness of his or her own thinking. Specifically, the thoughts that voiced the fatal decision to pick up the first drink. Like a sober fly on the wall, watching itself, stone cold sober, convince itself that the spider is a good friend, that this shiny web is perfectly safe and a yummy place for a nap. What those men of the 1930s did not yet see is the fundamental immaturity of such thinking, even as they wrote of Self-Will Run Riot and created a program for transforming childlike decision-making into realistic adult wisdom. One of the first psychiatrists to look at AA and the 12 steps was Harry Taibu, a real-life psychoanalyst, couch and everything. Harry was impressed by the recovery he saw for his patients, who apparently got it. He tried to make sense of the surrender that seemed to transform his alcoholic patients. Where are we here? It was in a psych unit way back then. When his conclusion, what surrendered? That was a question. His conclusion, question mark. What surrendered was nothing less than, quote, the persistence in the adult psyche of the psychic traits of the child. Does that sound like an inner child to you? Traits like assuming you are the center of the universe, possessing a tendency to do everything in a hurry, and having a distinct lack of patience, to assume you know how things should be and that others should snap to your command, like they would for a baby demanding a bottle or a change. Harry liked Freud's phrase for this unconscious attitude, quote, His Majesty the baby, unquote. Maybe this is too much psychobabble for you, but there is a simple way to check for the presence of an inner child. It works when it works, whether you were saying F it or I'll just have one, as you reached for the first drink / drugs, whatever. Just roll your own memory tape, back to any moment of deciding to take that first drink, drug, whatever. Never mind how many times you have circled the sun, how old you actually are. Never mind how old you actually are. At the moment of saying F it, probably upset about this or that, how old did you feel? What was your emotional age at the moments of saying, oh, I'll just have one? Or any other wishful decision to start using? I've asked this question many times over the years, and many of those times, not all, I have had the pleasure of introducing my client to his or her inner child, right in the act of deciding to pick up the first drink / drug / whatever. So what good does that do, you might ask? How does it help anything? Well, when you learn how to listen to your inner child, the little bugger is much more inclined to listen to you. The you whose life may depend upon reacting like an adult and making wiser and more effective decisions than F it or having just one. Not only that, inner child reactions are usually triggered by some reminder of trauma, something you experienced long ago when you were the child. This makes it an opportunity not just for awareness, but for healing and even growth, and I might add, for working your program, although the program by itself is not a cure for trauma. Most people who will read this book are trauma survivors. You come from alcoholic, addict, whatever homes, and have often suffered extremes of abuse or neglect unimaginable to normies. Even so-called functional alcoholic parents traumatize their kids by neglect, physical or mental absenteeism, and personality changes. Then you catch the disease yourself, and addiction traumatizes you. A blackout is a trauma, believe it or not. Loss of control is a trauma. Handcuffs, emergency rooms, car crashes, and rollovers. And every loss you suffered, job, relationship, anything you cared about, including just self-esteem, including the realization you may have traumatized your own kids. Trauma. In some humble karmic way, trauma begets trauma. And how does that happen? This is George's theory of trauma and addiction, but it's pretty low level and you can check it against your own experience. Once you have a trauma stored in your brain, it is stored as experience, not mere memory. And all it takes to wake up that experience, to get you feeling it again, is something slightly similar. Your trauma may have scored a 10 on the 10-point scale for suffering and sometimes terror, but it only takes a 1 or 2 to wake it up and get you overreacting. The trigger needs just a bit of similarity to the original event. But what is the heart of the trauma experience other than the pain and terror? As if you didn't know. Helplessness. You cannot run away and you cannot fight back. You cannot run away and you cannot fight back. And just what is it in daily life that slaps our faces with helplessness? Anything we don't control. Which is to say, just about everything. Stoplights, shoelaces, how our significant other brushes his or her teeth, the stock market, the climate, the next war or the last. You may show it or try to hide it in widely different ways, but it is bloody near impossible to be a trauma survivor without being a control freak. Not being in control will just feel a little too much like being helpless again. Oh, you may block it out, but the tension is building. The pressure is rising, day in, day out. Let me share a metaphor I heard. I wish I'd thought of it myself. I heard it exactly once, decades ago, from a speaker at an open AA meeting. Pretty sure it was Clancy, probably at Ohio Street in West LA, certainly no later than 1984 when I left West Los Angeles for good. Just so you know, what you hear here applies to personal details, not brilliant insights about all of us. And the statute of limitations for sharing what you heard is 30 years, in case you were wondering. I made that up. That's Rule 63. So, are we all good? The alcoholic, this speaker said, stands in the surf of life, always on his toes, ready for the great white shark to attack. And when it attacks, the alcoholic, addict, whatever, kicks butt. Maybe 3 or 4 times in a lifetime. But while we wait for the monster, said this speaker, the tiny piranha fish of daily life are eating the flesh right off our bones. Stoplights, broken shoelaces, web pages that go sideways or erase the last hour of work. Actually, I had a half-hour recording of this chapter erased. Actually, the phone just stopped and didn't tell me, so I didn't notice till after I'd read the whole damn thing to a phone that wasn't recording. That kind of thing. Apps that do not app, YouTube in this case. Significant others who squeeze the toothpaste, but don't roll it up tight like he or she should. Day in, day out. All those things we don't control that may seem to threaten us, defy us, or even reject us with their heartless refusal to obey our will. F it. No wonder so many of us are, quote, restless, irritable, and discontented. No wonder we suffer from, quote, low frustration tolerance. No wonder we sometimes react like 2-year-olds stuck in the no phase. The persistence in the adult psyche of the psychological traits of the child. Ugh. No wonder we suffer from, quote, a lack of proportion of the ability to think straight at times. That's out of the big book. And no wonder so many of us need a full-time program to let go of control on a daily basis, to coexist with people, places, and things that have their own ideas. And least wonder of all, so many of us would rather die than embrace, quote, acceptance is the answer to all my problems, unquote. And die we do. But trauma is just one source of immaturity or insanity. Think about craving itself. Desire posing as need. Craving, any craving, makes us think and act like children. And then there are personality issues, failures to mature in a healthy way. Even if some are genetic, all are marked by an inability to learn from experience. If you can't learn, how can you grow? This chapter opened with the cheery quote, grow up or die. Perhaps continued growth is only a byproduct of something more practical and necessary. Doing the day in, day out work of coping with life. Applying tools that increase your wisdom and serenity. Not to mention the well-being of those around you. We may, in fact, make such growth a goal in itself. But what seems to keep the process moving is the actual work we do to tame those piranha fish of daily life. To respond like a sober person. I don't know if you've been hearing the new verb, adulting. To be able to adult. Sort of like parenting. It really wasn't a verb until people used it as one. Adulting is pretty good. Facing problems, the stuff we control and the stuff we don't. Doing the right thing uncontrolled by desire or fear. This chapter closes with another quote about recovery and growing up. The speaker refers only to growth itself, not the life and death need for it. The words quivered from the throat of a cancer survivor with over a quarter of a century sober. Earl was 76 or so at the time and is now deceased. I have quoted what he said many times in many places. I never thought I'd live to be this old, he croaked, and I never thought I'd still be growing. A few months shy of my 70th birthday, and I'm past that now, I might well add, and I sure as hell never thought I would still need so much growing up at this age. But that's the subject for a different book, the one about emotional sobriety. So, thank you. Hope you enjoy this, can make some use of it.